Hi to all of you all over the country. Thanks so much for joining us today for today's District Administration webinar. My name is Kurt Ozdadurley. I am the webinar editor here at DA, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here on behalf of all of us here at DA. The title of our webinar, as you see here, is The Rise of Behavioral and Mental Health Needs Among Students, and it is being brought to you through the generous support of our sponsor for today, Presence Learning. First off, before we get started here, and as attendees and members of our audience are still coming in, a bit of background about our topic for today and what we'll be learning about. School administrators understand that academic growth is impacted by mental health and behavioral needs, but knowing how to support and meet these needs can be challenging to understand and to implement. Today we'll be learning how to design a framework for supporting school-based mental health services in your district using targeted approaches, implementation science, and effective strategic planning. We're looking forward to a very interesting and useful presentation and discussion here, plus live Q&A. We welcome your questions, so do stay tuned. We're going to get started in just a minute or two here. But quickly, before we do, just some brief housekeeping notes here. First off, the first item here on the slide, as it says, if you need technical support, you can use the chat panel that you should see at the right margin of your screen there. You can just select the name of our event host, Jason York. He is our producer here today, and let him know if you're having any technical problems. He'll be able to help you out there. Also, second item on the slide here, this is a common question we get if you're having audio problems with your computer at any time, or if you prefer to listen privately over the phone, we will post the phone number and access code that you can dial in that chat panel at the right there. Just keep an eye out for that. You can dial those numbers to get audio access over the phone if that's better or easier for you at any time. Also, as I said earlier, we welcome your questions. We anticipate there will be a lot of questions here today. If you have a question for our panelists, feel free to enter it in the Q&A at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen there. Just make sure it's set to all panelists, as it shows on the slide here. We will get to as many questions as we can in the Q&A at the end of the webinar today. So after the presentation, then we'll get to the questions, but feel free to ask a question at any time. Just type it in the Q&A. And again, make sure it's the Q&A and not the chat. Reserve your questions for the Q&A box, bottom right-hand corner. Also, speaking of questions, another common question we get, the last item on the slide here, is asking about accessing the presentation, either the slides or the recording. And the answer is yes. Everyone who registered or attended here today will be getting follow-up emails with links to where you can access the slides and a link to where the archive recording will be located. We are recording here, and we'll house it on the DA site. So you'll be able to go back over it. If you want to share the content with anyone on your team at your district, or go back over it at your own pace, and that'll enable you to go back over the content. So don't worry about that. You'll have ample opportunity to do that. Okay, so with that, on to our program here. Once again, we're very excited about today's presentation. We're very fortunate to welcome Dr. Isaiah Pickens. He's a licensed clinical psychologist and the CEO of Eye Opening Enterprises. We're also joined by Kate Eberly Walker. She's the CEO of Presence Learning, who is our sponsor for today's webinar. First off, Kate is going to give us some introductory remarks, and then we'll get to Dr. Pickens. So, Kate, it's great to have you. Welcome to today's webinar.
Thank you, Kurt. Presence Learning is so excited to welcome all of you to the first in our series of webinars addressing behavior and mental health needs in school. With our network of nearly 1,000 best-in-class clinicians, Presence Learning is the leading provider of live online related services for K-12 schools. We are helping schools meet the needs of their students in 3 core service areas: speech-language pathology, occupational therapy, and the topic of today, psychoeducational services. So schools are putting tremendous effort into providing the level of tiered behavior interventions, mental health services, educational assessments, and systemic supports that are necessary to meet student needs. And at Presence Learning, our mission is to help schools provide those services. We have a team of qualified professionals who are available for consultations, therapy, and assessments. We conduct research in partnership with publishers to build valid teleassessments, and we partner with school personnel to provide a full continuum of these services to students. We try to help schools deliver more than would be possible with their current time and resources alone. And we continue to hear loud and clear from our school partners that they care deeply about supporting the mental health and wellness of their students, and that what they need is practical, actionable advice on how to create programs and services that will have an impact. Dr. Isaac Pickens shares our belief that the best way to help schools tackle a big topic like behavior and mental health is by sharing practical approaches that can be put into action in schools. Dr. Pickens is the founder of Eye Opening Enterprises, a mental health and wellness education company that specializes in translating the science of mental health and wellness into practical tools for educators. He's a leader in this space, and we found his perspective so valuable that we invited him here to share it with all of you today. So Dr. Pickens, I'll turn it over to you. We're all so excited to learn from you today.
Great. Thanks so much, Kate. And I am so excited to be here with you and working with Presence Learning. I think the work that we're doing in schools has really helped to create a national conversation about how do we address mental health and wellness needs of our students throughout the nation. And so I want to take you on a journey today. And I want you to imagine that you are fast forwarded into the year 2045, and you're walking around in the grocery store, and a young man you vaguely recognize walks up to you and asks, "Do you remember me?" And you nod politely, even though you have no clue who this person is. And he begins to share about his story. And he shares about how he has held down a job over the past few years, how he has been able to support his family, how he's been a productive citizen time and time again. And as he speaks, it clicks to you that this was the kid who went down in infamy because of his meltdown one day in school after he came in late, as usual, and got into an argument with another student about something that was posted on Instagram, and he went ballistic on a lot of the other students in the classroom, got his shirt ripped, and eventually ran to the vice principal's office. And for you to see him in front of you now, a productive citizen, someone who is connected to all of the pieces that all of the things that you're doing, has you in a space where you feel so proud. And so today's conversation is about us understanding the journey of Johnny, the young man who you now recognize, and the James, who have had these mental health and behavioral issues. But how do we help them? How do we usher them into the promising lives that we believe that they can have both academically and personally? And so with that being said, I want to jump into our conversation today, talking about many of the rise in needs. But before we get into our conversation, throughout the course of our discussion, we're going to actually have poll questions. I like to hear from folks about what's going on. So you'll see a poll on the side to your right of the screen. I want you to go ahead and answer this question. What behavioral or mental health challenges do you most frequently deal with in your school or district? Maybe it's anxious, worried behavior, hyperactive behavior, depression or suicidal behavior, substance use, aggressive behavior. And some of you might say, these kids have nothing on the kids I got at home. So whatever your response is, go ahead and take a minute to answer, and then we'll come back with the results in a second. So we'll give folks about 10 more seconds to respond, and then we will see the results. All right. So it seems that a lot of people are dealing with kids who are anxious and worried. which really does map onto much of what we're seeing in the national conversation around this for students in schools. People are also seeing quite a bit of hyperactive behavior and a good amount of aggressive behavior. So I'm glad that hopefully everyone was able to participate in this. We'll have a couple more throughout this. And I'm also glad to see that most of the problems don't seem like they're happening in your personal home. You have challenges in your school. And so hopefully you'll get tips for both as we go through this conversation today. Now, I want to talk a little bit about why we see this rise in some of the behavioral and mental health needs of the young people that we're serving. In fact, the rise that we see is really historic. Research that has looked at the 2010s found that young people between the ages of 9 and 17 is estimated that about 21% of them show signs of some kind of symptom from the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which we use as psychologists to look at different behavioral disorders, mental health disorders. And in fact, between 2009 and 2017, the number of high schoolers who contemplated suicide increased by 25%, and those who were diagnosed with clinical depression grew by 37%. So if people are feeling like there is some kind of change in what we have been seeing with a lot of our young people, there is definitely a trend that has been occurring over the course of the past decade that really supports that and that research has looked at. Now, why do we see that trend and that change over the course of this past decade? Well, one of the main reasons that we have started to see changes in this is believed is because we're living in a complex time where information is ubiquitous. It is everywhere, and people and students in particular have access to information that they may not have had access to in the past. And what this creates is many more barriers to students sometimes being able to understand how to manage challenges and also being able to create a sense of psychological safety. So when we talk about psychological safety, part of what we're talking about is a person's ability to manage the stress that they're experiencing or reach out to someone who can help them manage this stress. And when that sense of psychological safety doesn't feel stable, it feels like it's being undermined, it can be really hard to focus on school. It can be really hard to focus on how to connect with others in a healthy way. And researcher John Twenge has followed this for a number of years, and her work is very interesting because she specifically looks at the role that technology has played in how our students deal with some of the age-old problems that they've had, that young people have had in the past. Issues such as, do I fit in? How do I connect with others? Well, that causes a lot of anxiety, naturally, but what we're seeing, particularly as it relates to anxiety and depression with a lot of our young people, is social media heightens and magnifies the challenges that we've seen in the past, whether it's harassment, intimidation, and bullying that happens through cyberbullying. As I talked about with Johnny at the beginning of the story, how many of you have seen in your school districts or in your schools kids who come in so frustrated, partially because of what they read on social media that another friend has shared? And the challenge with that is when there has been so many challenges with things that have happened outside the classroom and those issues coming in the classroom, what is left teachers and staff to do is wonder what might be triggering some of these behaviors. And then when there isn't the support in place to really support ongoing reviewing of these behaviors and reviewing of these situations, it can make it really difficult to be able to understand what's the right intervention. And so part of what we want to talk about today is how do we start to identify when this is coming into the school environment and how do we properly respond to these different issues. Now, in addition to some of the issues that happen on social media, part of what can happen as well is that there's heightened levels of social isolation, where students don't actually feel connected in meaningful ways with either adults or other people in their life. And this is particularly challenging when we see kids who experience adverse childhood experiences and trauma. So this can be abuse, neglect, it can be community violence, it can be a number of issues that we know students around the country experience and they keep to themselves. Sometimes we talk about it as being their invisible backpack. So it's all of these beliefs that they have about the world maybe being dangerous, the world not caring about them, teachers not caring about them, that they come into the classroom with. And now, without the teacher or the staff at the school understanding, this kid is really upset, or they're isolating themselves, or they're not able to focus because they're thinking about things outside the classroom environment. And again, this is impacting not just how the student feels, but how the school environment and climate is unfolding. And so one of the most important things that we've understood around all of these pieces is the importance of us accurately identifying what this need is and how this rise has come about, especially as it relates to ADHD and autism spectrum disorder. We've learned more about some of the biological underpinnings of this and how we can better support the students in these settings when they might not have the social skills or ability to regulate their behavior. And so the combination of really looking at the changes in information, how it's processed, and how students connect with others after that information is gained has played a huge role in the levels of mental health and behavioral disorders that we see. And so to really be able to tackle this effectively, part of what we have to understand is the impact it's had on school climate. I know we have a number of administrators, we have a number of superintendents and other school professionals on this call. And one of the most important aspects of your role as a leader within schools is to help create a school climate where not only students feel supported, but the staff feels supported and capable of doing the jobs that are getting the grades that they an academic environment where students can reach their full potential. And so what we see in many of the schools around the country is the behavioral and mental health needs of certain students can really influence the school climate for the entire school building. And so that's why when we talk about behavioral health and mental health needs, we're not talking solely about Tier 2 or Tier 3 supports. We're also talking about those universal and not necessarily targeted, but universal supports that really help students feel like they have the skills to manage themselves socially and emotionally so that the experience of other students isn't disrupted by what's going on in this one student's life and experience. But here's the bigger impact that this can have in addition to what it has on the actual classroom. Staff can feel burnt out. And I know just working with staffs in schools around the country that there's so many staff who feel that the behaviors and the mental health challenges that they have been experiencing with students are above and beyond their pay grade, are above and beyond what they signed up for. And what that can do when that's not addressed is it can really erode one of the most fundamental components of a school climate that is both effective and also able to keep everyone bought into the vision of the leaders, is it erodes trust. And the trust can erode from several different directions. Students begin to lack trust in teachers because they believe teachers believe that they're always going to show bad behavior. They believe the teacher's intent is not to support them, but is to punish them. And so that trust is eroded. Teachers begin to lose trust for administration. They feel like the tools that they once had in the past are now being taken away and replaced by what they consider mushy tools or soft tools. And so the teachers begin to lack trust for the administration. Administration feels like they might not be getting the support needed from the district. And so there becomes some lack of trust from that perspective. And then finally, the parents feel that the schools are not serving their kids in the best way that they need to be served. And so when mental health and behavioral health needs are not addressed from a universal and a targeted approach, what can happen is trust is eroded. And once that trust is eroded, it makes it very difficult to implement anything with effectiveness and and fidelity. And so part of what we really want to talk about in this journey and how we really allow ourselves to create school environments that promote the optimal school climate is being able to both think about the universal approaches that we're going to use to address mental health and behavioral needs, as well as many of these targeted approaches as well. So, what do schools around the country do to really address this? What we've seen and what I've seen working with colleagues around the country who focus on mental health and behavioral needs within schools are three main areas that many schools really begin to focus on when they start to see a rise in mental health and behavioral needs. The first approach often is to think about how do we double down on punishment. And the idea behind this, even though it doesn't have ill intent, the idea behind this is to really allow students to understand the consequences of their behavior, which is a part of becoming a productive citizen in society. And so with that, schools may feel that it's important for students to have some time away from the school building or away from the classroom, whether it's in-school suspension, out-of-school suspension, to be able to manage all of the different behavioral challenges that they're experiencing in different ways. And this double down on punitive approaches, what it does is it changes the course that a student may go when they're having behavioral needs. So if in one school, the course of dealing with behavioral and mental health challenges is for students to see a counselor or to connect with some behavioral mental health services, then that course of intervention is much different than if the first line of defense is the school resource officer and the in-school suspension processes. And so part of what we want to think about as we go through this is how these approaches have implications not only for managing the behavior in the moment, but the long-term academic trajectory of the young people that receive that intervention, as well as for what people perceive in the overall school climate. The other piece that we see with a lot of schools is that schools figure it's better to do something rather than nothing, which is completely understandable. We're all stretched with the amount of resources that we have, the ability we have to really be able to address issues. And so what schools may do at times is they'll put into effect different whole school approaches, whether it's PBIS, SEL programming, looking at trauma-informed practices. They'll spend a lot of energy really putting together some really important programs. But what might be a challenge is actually following through with that programming in a way that is really shows fidelity to how that program was not only meant to be used, but also how that program was meant to be adapted with this particular group or the particular students and community that you're working in. And so what can happen when this occurs is that because you're using so many whole school approaches simultaneously, it feels that there's a lot of energy and effort going into addressing these issues. But the question is, do these ways or these approaches to dealing with behavioral and mental health challenges actually work? And the answer is kind of, but often for a lot of schools, these approaches can fail. And here's one of the reasons why these approaches can be really challenging for a lot of schools. One, it really can put schools and school districts in a crisis mode approach. So as opposed to having a more strategic plan around how you go about being able to manage the behavioral needs of students, how do you go about thinking about an integrated approach to the different programming, you really are trying to put out a lot of fires at one time. And when this happens, what can really be difficult is focusing most of your energy on the vast majority of students who need that academic support. And so much of the energy is going into the few students who are showing high levels of behavioral and mental health needs. It becomes difficult to create the kind of school climate that really addresses all of the students' needs in a way that both appreciates what the students who have behavioral issues might need in order to academically achieve, but also uses the richness of the students who are on the ground. And it continues to build that sense of trust that we have solutions to be able to support students in the environment, in the school environment. The other piece of this that can become really difficult is it can become very, very challenging to have the same language around some of these behavioral health issues. I'm sure from just your relationships in life, whether personal or professional, you have experienced someone who technically speaks the same language as you, but does not speak the same language as you. And what can happen when we're in schools that are constantly in crisis mode, constantly dealing with these high-level behavioral and mental health issues, is that you have some teachers who say, this is what we are supposed to do when this student shows this particular issue. And another set of teachers say, no, the administration said that this was the process by which we go about this. And then the administration said, no, this is what the district is focusing on. And when you have this different languages around how to address and respond to these behavioral health and mental health needs, what happens is there's miscommunication that can lead to really a fragmented approach. And so thinking about the big picture of what you're aiming to achieve, a big part of what you're aiming to achieve with the behavioral health and mental health needs and interventions that you're creating is an integrated approach to support academic and whole child development. And when you have multiple approaches to do this, it can really make it difficult to be able to effectively put this into action. Part of what I always reference when we talk about how we build trust in the school environment and how we build some of these self-regulation skills for students is I always reference the marshmallow study that I'm sure many people are familiar with. It's a famous study in which a 6 or 7-year-old is put into a room with an experimenter. They give them a marshmallow and they say, hey, you can have this marshmallow now, or you can wait a couple of minutes when I come back in and you can get 2 marshmallows. And you see the kid, if you ever watch one of these videos, sniffing the marshmallow and, feeling that he just cannot hold it in. And most kids, they say, I don't care, I'm going to eat this one marshmallow. But some kids are able to have what we call the frustration tolerance to wait for what's next. And so they've done this experiment in a number of ways. And one of the ways they did this experiment is they had the experimenters say that they were going to bring back a game before the marshmallow. Well, in the experiment that the experimenter brought back the game, the kids were able to wait and hold on for that second marshmallow. But in the experiment where the experimenter said that they were going to bring back the game and they did not, well, what happened in that situation is the kid was much less likely to wait for that second marshmallow. And what we have really learned from that is that when these programs that we're putting in place aren't done consistently and with fidelity, part of what can happen is the trust that these interventions that we're using will effectively support the development of these social emotional skills that will address these mental health issues is tremendous. And so I wanted to give you a foundation around why we see some of the challenges that we see. In this next section, I'm going to really give you some concrete tools around what you can do at both a systems level and a targeted school level to think about this. But before we get to this next component, I want us to answer another poll question. And so this next poll question is thinking about how do we use a holistic approach that's guided by implementation science. So I want you to think about what has been the most successful whole school approach your school or district has used in the past year. Think about the social emotional learning programs, the positive behavior interventions and supports, trauma-informed schools, restorative justice. And for some of you, you might say the most successful thing has been when people did just what I said. I told them to do it, and they did it. That was successful. So go ahead and take a moment to answer this, and then we'll be back in about 30 seconds. All right, we can go ahead and show the responses. And thank you for those who are sharing their comments around these as well. All right, so it seems that many of you have done PBIS. And it's been very successful. So I'm really glad to hear it. It sounds like a lot of people have tried some of the other SEL, trauma-informed, or restorative justice practices. And there's a minority of you who said they just did what I said, and that worked. So I appreciate all the responses that folks have. Now, here's what people have gotten right, but not executed on it right. They've gotten right that we need whole school approaches. The work that Presence Learning does, the work that many PBIS, many of these whole school approaches do, is very effective. But the challenge is the way that is executed or that schools might roll it out or support the work being implemented is flawed. And that challenge makes it difficult for all of staff to be on the same page. And so part of what we want to think about as a first step to effectively being able to address these mental health and behavioral issues is thinking about how do we integrate implementation science in a way that allows us to have buy-in from our staff and also roll out what we're rolling out effectively, regardless of the program. So what you're looking at on the screen, I know you might not be able to read all of the words, but this is an implementation science strategy called the EPIS framework. So the EPIS framework stands for what you see around that circle: exploration, preparation, implementation, and sustainment. And this has been found to be a very effective implementation science approach to being able to implement a number of whole school, whole system programs in child serving institutions ranging from schools, justice, child welfare. What makes this so effective, and what I've seen in the work I've done in different schools around the country, is that oftentimes people don't always know why they're putting programs in place, and they also don't know the steps it takes to effectively put these programs in place. And even if there's a manual, there is still a number of practices that help you have a common language around this. So in the exploration stage of the implementation process, you're pretty much doing a lot of your groundwork. You're researching what might work in your setting, and also what resources you have available. So you're identifying the strengths and the gaps. And what we found is that when people employ this approach to thinking about putting into practice PBIS, restorative justice, trauma-informed schools, all of these different components around whole school approaches, they are able to get really champions at the outset of their project as opposed to finding them at the end, because during this exploration stage, you're really starting to get a sense of where are the areas that we want to focus on. And also, what you can't read within this circle is exploring what are some of the outer contexts. So there might be community organizations, there might be supporting groups within the school and within the parent community that might be able to support implementation of this, but there's also an inner context, and this goes back to the idea of school culture. I really want us to anchor a lot of what we're talking about in terms of the direction that we're going in terms of addressing mental health and behavioral needs, and the idea of these whole school approaches and this implementation science is really aimed at shifting school culture to increase trust and to increase psychological safety, that ability to manage and deal with the stress that's happening around you. Because at the heart of all of the mental health and behavioral needs that many students have is a sense.
Oh, I'm not sure. Oh, there. Sorry, Isaiah, you dropped out for a second there, but it sounds like you're back.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened. I'm so. Can you guys hear me now?
Yes, sounds good. Thanks.
Okay, great. I think I'm so passionate about this. I blew out my really allows it to be an approach that gains buy-in from many of the staff, is that you're able to do your projects in a more stepwise approach. You're able to focus your mental health and behavioral interventions in a stepwise approach. So during the preparation phase, you're piloting many of the different processes, and we'll talk about some of the examples of pilots that I've seen around the country that have been effective. And you're also getting feedback to see how you need to adjust it for your particular environment. And then once you get into the implementation phase, this is when you're trying to scale up and build capacity. This is when you're starting to identify who are the champions who can be supports to actually train and help others put into practice the mental health and behavioral practices and interventions that you think will be effective, but also how do you create processes, formal processes, whether it's policies, whether it's procedures in your team meetings, whether it's morning routines, that allow you to be able to infuse this in the school environment and really make it a part of that school culture. And then finally, with sustainment, what you're really thinking about is a lot of quality assurance processes. So this may involve being able to have a set of organizational assessment tools, data gathering tools that allow you to see on an ongoing basis, is the program that you're putting into practice effective in the way that you are both approaching it, but also effective in the way that it has an ongoing impact on reducing some of the behaviors that you want to see, but not just reducing. Part of what we're talking about with the holistic approach is not only avoiding the things we don't want to see, but striving for what we want. And so is it also increasing the academic outcomes that you would like to see with your students? Is it increasing school connectedness, which is a huge protective factor for a lot of students who have mental health and behavioral challenges? And so what does this look like when we go into different school settings? One of the first aspects of understanding some of these targeted approaches to creating mental health and behavioral health supports for students is being able to accurately identify the need. So many of you already provide school climate questionnaires and surveys that allow you to be able to identify the need that students have, and also screening and assessment processes that are a part of the disciplinary process. Now, part of what we've seen is that when schools are able to really engage in a collaborative way with the students and the families to be able to identify need and do it also from a strengths-based perspective, it can go a long way in infusing this in the school environment. So let me give you an example. There's a school out in California that does school climate questionnaires on a regular basis. And part of what they have done in order to really help the students better understand how school climate plays a role in their academic experiences is they train the students to understand the data from their school climate questionnaire and have them presented to the school and the students in order to think about and to strategically plan how they can use this information to effectively shift the environment. Now, in addition to that, what we've seen in schools around the country, particularly some schools in New Orleans that a colleague of mine worked with, is thinking more in a more focused manner about the disciplinary process. And when you think about the disciplinary process, often what happens is it begins with an office referral. An educator or teacher says, the student is not behaving the way I need them to behave in this class and is disrupting the class, and they suggest that the student goes to the office. Now, part of what the intervention is hopefully getting them some support in the office. But for a whole school holistic approach, part of what you really want to create is teachers and staff within the school who feel that they have the competency and the ability to address needs on the ground. And so what these schools did in New Orleans is they actually added a checkbox to the office referral that gave 2 or 3 simple strategies that staff can use before sending kids to out-of-office referrals, and the staff had to check that off just to make sure that they did these different tasks. And so these could be tasks ranging from going to a calming corner that has a number of activities that students can use to soothe their senses. Part of what we see with kids who have mental health and behavioral challenges is that much of their frustration, it elevates because they have tension in their body, whether it is, feeling tight, and you see kids who clench their fists, kids who start sweating. And the way to really calm that down is to give them opportunities to soothe their senses, whether it's through being able to play with Play-Doh or having something that they smell that calms the body down. And what it does is it slows and is able to reduce that stress response so that students can effectively think in that moment. Because when students are elevated in that space, usually what's happening is the part of their brain that's focused on survival and staying safe is highly activated. And the part of their brain that can actually better read situations, make better decisions, is less activated. And so the route to being able to activate that part, the learning brain, we call it, that can make decisions better, is by helping students calm their body down first. And so a simple intervention that was done for these New Orleans schools is simply creating a checkbox to both remind the teacher that there's tools that they can use in the classroom that will help kids better regulate themselves, and also to track data over time to see who is using these targeted approaches and how effective is that in their classroom. So it serves a dual purpose. Another strategy that we've seen done using implementation science and really trying it out at a very, in the preparation phase, the pilot stage, is being able to identify warm and cool zones in the school. So this involves simply creating a map or seeing the map of your school and identifying where are the most incidents occurring. So an incident can be arguments, it can be fights, it can be where students use substances, it can be a number of different behavioral health and mental health challenges that you see. And when you're able to actually map those out, part of what you're able to do is, one, see if there's actually environmental factors that are creating a heightened level of behavioral health and mental health problems that are occurring in certain areas. And then you have the ability and also the visual to support teachers and staff to actually have targeted interventions in these particular areas within the school. And so for many schools that we have within our work that we do throughout the nation is we have them do this warm and cool blueprinting zones for their schools. And then what we do is we give them an intervention to support that. So for what a lot of our schools have done is they started to integrate threshold greetings at certain areas of the school that have that have hot zones. We call these hot or warm zones where there's a lot of these incidents. And so these threshold greetings are greeting kids at this portion in the morning. There was a school in Connecticut that we worked with that integrated this around the cafeteria area in the morning because they found that students were coming in after having read different comments on social media, very upset, and particularly those who already had behavioral health or mental health needs, elevating tremendously. And so they put more staff in this area so the area was monitored better, but then they also included a greeting to help diffuse what might already be bubbling just below the surface. And so all of these interventions can be done in a very stepwise approach. So that's where the EPIS model comes into play. They didn't do this school-wide right at the outset because they didn't know how the school would respond to it. They piloted it in a certain area, in the cafeteria area at first, got a sense of how it worked, and then from there, they scaled up and they went into that implementation and sustainment phase to make it a school-wide practice. So this is one approach that that when we talk about targeted strategies based on implementation science, another really important piece is to be able to consider how you use whole school approaches that are grounded in relational practice. You'll hear me say this a number of times over the course of our presentation. Every intervention, for whether it's behavioral health and mental health intervention or is a social emotional learning program, PBIS, is filtered through relationships. One of the preeminent educators in the world who speaks about many of these issues said that kids don't learn from people they don't like. and maybe we don't have to go that far because I'm sure there's plenty of students who don't like some of their teachers and are still learning, but the ability to connect and to create a sense of trust can play a huge role in the receptivity of students being able to not only hear the different interventions that a teacher is proposing, but to also implement it and try it out without being triggered when they fail. Because that's what we see with a lot of our kids who have behavioral and mental health needs, is that even if they do attempt an intervention, part of what becomes challenging is they're probably not going to do it effectively the first time. And so when they aren't doing it effectively the first time, this can create a snowball effect to create greater elevated behavior, more disruptive, and more frustrated. And so when I talked earlier about Johnny, who had the behavior issue that made him get into a fight over Instagram, then run out of the classroom and rip his shirt, well, he ran to a vice principal. And he ran to a vice principal who he felt connected with. And what a lot of people believed in this school is that this vice principal could talk to him in a way that others couldn't. And what I would argue is that when we see these types of connections, it's not that certain people just have a better relationship with the young person. It's that the people who have the better relationship have a set of skills that are replicable if we are very focused in the way that we integrate this into the school. And so these skills can really be scaled up when there's effective implementation practices to support the scale up. And so here's what I mean by this. For many schools that we work with within the country, part of what they've tried to integrate are restorative practices that allow for peace circles, that allow for an actual process when there is some damage done to or harm done to another person, to have an actual process in place to repair that damage that has been done. does it benefits tremendously both the school climate, but it also benefits the academic experience of students, particularly students who have behavioral health and mental health needs, because it allows them to trust that the intentions of the teachers and the intentions of the staff are actually to help and to repair damage and not solely to punish them. Not to just double down and not just to put programs in place for the sake of putting programs in place. And so a part of this as well can really help to destigmatize some of the issues that a lot of kids who have behavioral health and mental health needs have. So I spoke earlier about these threshold greetings. Well, in addition to some of these threshold greetings, part of what we've worked with a number of schools around the country is creating what we call relational routines and relational expectations. And so these relational routines may be something as simple as having a morning wellness practice that students do together, having a morning practice where students talk about how they appreciate other students or a challenge that they've faced in different ways and how they've handled it. But all of these practices sometimes feel to educators and to staff that this is extra. This is not what I'm here to do. This is not the work. This is extra to the work. But in fact, this is the work, because so much of the student's academic experience and them leaving all of the things that have happened outside the classroom at the door involve them feeling that they are both known within the classroom and they have the ability to effectively connect with others within the classroom. And so from a implementation science perspective, you are the schools as well as districts have the ability to actually systematize a lot of these practices. So for some of our schools that we've worked with, part of what they've integrated with their PBIS and SEL and trauma-informed approaches are relational routines that really allow for students to understand not only what it is that they are able to do with their students on a regular basis, but also sets the expectation that everyone is doing it, and that the teachers who seem to just have good relationships with students aren't the only ones who are capable of creating these connections and ultimately changing the trajectory of the academic experience of many students. And so as we think about this, a final area before I talk about a couple of case examples around how schools and districts have approached this is really being able to partner with school and mental health agencies to effectively implement many of these practices. Part of what we've seen in many of the schools that we've worked in is an understanding around how schools, how staff can use the community to get engagement around many of these practices. One of the most powerful stories I've seen is a school that created a trauma-informed program for their community in Boston, but they found that no parents were coming because the parents did not want to engage in a trauma-informed program. So they worked with someone in the community, and this is in particular a Somali community. They worked with someone in this Somali community, and within this community, this person said, you should reframe the title of your program to a resilience building program. Well, after they did that, they didn't have enough space. They had to turn people away. And this was really a part of their effective partnering with students. I'm on the National Board for Communities and Schools, which focuses on integrated support services. And being able to identify integrated support services in the community can go a long way. The other piece I will highly encourage people to think about as we talk about the ways in which students and staff are able to create and affect school climate is to really think about how do you address staff wellness. Burnout has been a tremendous issue with many of our schools around the country and retaining teachers. And part of the way that many school districts have addressed this has been having a focused approach to promoting staff wellness. And this may be helping staff have their own calming zones and spaces where they're able to regulate their body more effectively and actually deal with a lot of the challenges that they may experience by constantly being exposed to students who have behavioral health and mental health issues. And so briefly, I want to share just two case examples that really play a huge role, and then we'll take some questions. A school that we worked with in New York really has done a great job of trying to bring in a trauma-informed and culturally responsive approach with professional development. But what really solidified a lot of the work that they had started to do within their school was creating implementation teams. And so these implementation teams generally consist of a combination of school staff ranging from teachers to teachers' aides to administration to support staff throughout the school to really get a representative sample of how do we better understand the execution of a lot of the practices that we're trying to implement within the school system, and particularly, how do we start to identify psychological safety? One of the pieces that this school already did was have what they call reflection sheets. And these reflection sheets allow teachers to identify triggers and early warning signs for students so that they're better able to respond to it in the classroom. Well, one of the practices that we did with this implementation team is we inventoried all of the early warning signs and triggers within school, and then we made that public for all of the teachers to have access to, and then created a set of standard responses that teachers could have when they start to see these triggers and early warning signs. And so that simple process of identifying, inventorying, and being able to support this could go a long way. And so I'm going to very quickly go through this last slide about a district so that we can have some time for questions. I'm sure plenty of folks have questions. There's another district in Ohio that has done a great job of destigmatizing support services. So everyone knows the Every Student Succeeds Act has really done a good job of thinking about the whole child. And what this district found is that initially, many educators and teachers felt that the behavioral and mental health needs of students was a tier 2, tier 3 type of support. So they didn't need to think about it unless there was a problem. Well, that made it very difficult to make universal practices that are effective for the school climate really effective in their school environments. And so what this school district did is created an office for positive school culture. And so they took out support services as from just being simply focused on behavioral challenges of students to put it into this district-wide team that also focused on SEL, PBIS, restorative practice, and used a more holistic approach. And they created this infographic to help focus it into a more, to help create guiding principles to allow people to understand not just that we're addressing these needs, but the reasons behind addressing these needs in an effective way. And so part of what I want to really encourage you to consider is not just using whole school approaches in ways that seem to plug holes, but taking a step back and thinking about how you can explore many of these issues holistically. And so when we're focused on this, I'm going to stop now. I'm going to have this last poll question, and then I'll take some questions from others around the risk and rewards. So this last poll question, what has been your most surprising success from your school or district's behavioral or mental health programming? Students' academic outcomes, improving due to support, increase in student-teacher or student connectedness, more equitable discipline, staff feel more confident, or just the fact that you still have money for it. Maybe that's the biggest success that you have. We'll take about 20 more seconds. In the interest of time, we won't take too long with this, and then we'll move on to this final slide and then questions. All right, let's go ahead and end this poll. And it's a lot of responses, so it's taking a moment to calculate all of what you guys are putting down here. All right, so as we wait for this, the responses, there we go. All right, so increase in student-teacher and student-student connectedness. I love that so many people said this as what they've seen as the biggest improvement due to their whole school approaches, because this is the foundation for anything that you're going to do next. And it seems like it's a smattering of many of the other ones. And congratulations to all those folks who still have funded programs. So I want to end here because there's great risk and reward to the potential opportunities that you have. students have the potential to disrupt classrooms when we don't address these mental health and behavioral needs, but there's also a potential for them to have tremendous both academic success, but also success in connecting with others from a social emotional space. One of my favorite researchers is Raj Chetty, who he's a Harvard economist, and he talks about this idea of lost Einsteins. And he says that there's kids who may be able to cure cancer, but because of their zip code, don't have the access. And so when we talk about behavioral and mental health needs, we're often talking about challenges that are happening outside the classroom or within the student that can be supported, but we have to be thoughtful about our approach to being able to adjust it. And particularly, our approach has to involve, one, being able to think about some of these whole school approaches. But one thing I really want to elevate is we have to think about doing it in a culturally responsive way. We can all have blind spots about how we connect with our students, whether it's implicit bias, whether it's kind of our own experiences, whether it's actually the students themselves and their inability or challenge connecting with us because of a lot of things that have happened in their life, their invisible backpack. And so it's tremendously important for us to be able to be mindful of the both risk if we're not attending to these really important issues that share the life story of our kids, and also being able to really see the potential of who they can become. Because what happened with Johnny was that he was able to talk to his vice principal, who Johnny was a Latino young man, and he was able to speak in Spanish to his vice principal, who connected with him. And from there, they were able to connect with the family and really create some real solutions for Johnny in the future. So with that being said, I'm going to open it up for questions in these last 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Isaiah, so much. Yeah, we'll get to the Q&A here, and Kate from Presence Learning will take over for that. Kate, you want to mention your next webinar here before we get to the questions?
Sure. First, thank you so much, Dr. Pickens, for all of your great insights. And we've got a lot of great questions coming in, so we're going to cover as many of those as we can. First, I did want to take the opportunity to remind everyone to please join us again on Tuesday, April 28th for the next webinar in our mental health series. We'll share the story of how one of our district partners built a successful system of support to address the rise in behavioral and mental health needs among its students. Dr. Michael Webb will join us, the Assistant Superintendent of Student Support at Tomball ISD in Texas, and he'll explain how they built their behavioral health system of care. So he's going to talk about the overall need and program goals, focusing on restorative practices, staffing, wraparound supports, funding sources, and outcomes. So you'll get some new ideas and concrete examples of programs and resources that we think can work for any district. So with that, now I will move on to your questions. So Dr. Pickens, we're seeing a few recurring themes popping up in the Q&A. One is around how to apply what works for younger children to a high school population. So I'll read out one of the questions. In my experience, it is easier to develop common language with younger students and staff working in those buildings. What is a recommended strategy for developing common language to respond to behavioral needs with junior high and high school students?
That's a great question. And so I will say a couple of approaches are important. One is taking a very collaborative approach to developing an understanding around some of those needs. I find that with junior high and high school students, they do have the ability to better articulate what might be triggering or creating an early warning sign for them. And being able to take that information and synthesize it along with the staff around common red flags or even experiences, you can reframe it to really be from a positive strengths-based perspective. But what are ways that we can really think about helping young people better identify some of those triggers and early warning signs, and then respond in ways that come from a place of both healthy connection as well as being able to address kind of whatever damage may have been caused by their behavioral challenges. And so some of the specific strategies that some schools have used around this collaborative approach has been some initial expectation setting at the beginning of the school year, but also, again, going back to some restorative practices, using some of these peace circles The school that I mentioned earlier in the presentation, their idea of using peace circles to communicate about kind of what are the internal experiences that are shaping the academic environment for students wasn't just for their students. They actually had that for staff as well. And so the staff were able to have a better understanding of how they operated. And from there, that created a more universal language around how to deal with these issues. The last thing I'll say is not to forget to engage people based on their cultural background. And when I say culture, I'm not just talking about race and ethnicity. I'm talking about gender. I'm talking about religion. I'm talking about your socioeconomic status. All of these social identities, all of these components comprise how people navigate their environment. And so when you're able to effectively engage parents and the family in the process of kind of redefining what are some of the behavioral challenges and then use them as champions, it really does allow the parents and the staff to have champions who identify the need. Last thing I'll say, and I'm sorry, I know we want to take one more question, is for the district I mentioned, they actually created paid positions for peer leaders. So they paid teachers to become champions for programs to train other teachers. And I think that putting your money where your mouth is a really important approach that allows high schools and junior highs to particularly start to create this common language.
Thank you. That is great. That's very helpful. I'm going to sneak in one more question. We've still got a minute left. So another theme that we saw a lot of questions come up about was screening tools and strategies for screening and assessment. So one question was, what does the screening and assessment as part of the disciplinary process look like? So any thoughts about screening approaches?
That's a great question. I think one of the challenges that a lot of schools have is that they don't want to overscreen and not have the services available to support students. And so one of the recommendations I generally have for schools who are starting the screening process is to look at your kind of top 10% of kids who are constantly getting behavioral referrals and to start a process of screening with them. What some schools have done is they've created MOUs with community-based mental health centers or partnerships with cross-system organizations, whether kids are involved in child welfare, et cetera, to when these kids have disciplinary issues, instead of kind of sending them directly to a disciplinary action school resource officer, they send them somewhere to get screened and assessed. One school, in fact, they changed their policy in Connecticut from referring their kids to school resource officers to actually engaging the EMTs and the emergency mobile services in their community through an MOU. And what happened was these kids who had these high-level disciplinary actions, it was due to behavioral health and mental health issues, were screened, assessed, and then the services were there for them to get those. And so that's a place I would recommend people starting with their high behavioral need kids, getting them screened and assessed and connecting that with the IEP when necessary. And then from there, you can pilot it using the implementation science approach we talked about and scale up over time.
That is great, and thank you so much. I could go on. We have so many great questions. For every participant who asked a question, we will follow up and answer them after the session. But for now, we're going to wrap up. Thanks, everyone, for attending, and I'll turn it back over to Kurt to give us details from here.
Thank you so much, Kate, for being with us, and Isaiah, of course. Thank you so much. I know you had to cover a lot of ground in a short amount of time there. We really appreciate it. So yes, we're going to wrap things up here. Speaking of questions, we got a lot of questions, folks asking about if they'll be able to access the presentation at a later time. And again, yes, everyone who registered, you'll be getting follow-ups with links to the slides and a link to this recording so you can go back over it. If you want to share with anyone on your team at your district, you'll have ample opportunity to do that. So once again, on behalf of district administration and everyone here at DA, I'd like to thank our speakers, Isaiah and Kate. Thank you so much for being with us. And again, to everyone in our audience, thank you so much for joining us today. I do hope you found our webinar informative and useful to you. Producing events like this one is just part of our mission here at DA to inform school district leaders like you about news and trends in the field of K-12 school system management. You'll find more coverage about issues such as the ones we discussed here in the pages of our magazine, as well as our website and digital edition. and in our various email newsletters, which you can sign up for from our website. And once again, just another reminder here, if you're interested in accessing the presentation, everyone will be getting a follow-up email with a link to the slides and the archive recording. We'll archive it on the DA site on the URL you see on your screen here. We'll have it there for the next 12 months if you want to go back over it and access it. And again, everyone will be getting follow-up emails with links to those, so you'll be able to go back over it and access it and go through it. All right, so that is it for today's event. Once again, thank you all so much for joining us. I'm Kurt Isley-Durley for District Administration on behalf of everyone here at DA. Goodbye, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks so much for joining us today.